In this video, I'm going to talk about the RGraph data grid component that was initially added in version 6.21 and then significantly improved and extended in version 6.22. It's an easy way to show data grid tables to your users. It's very customizable with standard CSS and extensible with the rest of events and API calls that are available. It can be quickly and easily integrated into your pages and forms, so it allows you to quickly and easily build your website and standardize the look of data tables across all of your pages. Okay, now if we click through to the documentation page, this is the main data grid component documentation page that you'll find on the website. And if we go down the page, right down, then the example is right there. Here's an example of the data grid with the search feature enabled, resizable columns, which by default are persistent, though you can change that if you wish, and paging. All of these can be disabled if they're not required. It also shows how you can have HTML in the columns if you want, though this is not the default and is something that you'll need to enable. The button below the data grid can be used to reset the column sizes back to the defaults, demonstrating one of the many API calls that are available. Everything is documented on the data grid documentation page. And if we have a look there, clicking on page numbers gets you a different page. We can do a search. Try searching for my name. Lovely. Limits to those rows that contain the search phrase. And click on the cross to get rid of the search. And let's see there. We've got the resizable columns and going to ellipses when there's not enough space. And the button there, the API call, resets the column sizes back to what they were originally. And then below the data grid, there's the code that goes into generating the data grid. The two RGraph libraries are included, as you can see there, the Common Core and the data grid library itself. The div container is defined. The actual div, let me just highlight it for you there. The actual div required for the data grid is just that. The outer div centers the data grid, and the button is the button, the reset button that you see there. And then we have the code, the data for the data grid that you can see there. It's a standard JavaScript array. And the code looks very much like a standard RGraph chart, just like that. And that's the code that generates the data grid. The style of the data grid object code is much the same as the other RGraph objects, mainly being key value properties. The style property is interesting though, as it allows you to specify CSS for the data grid in much the same way as you'd write regular CSS. Though here, the ID of the container div that you give when you create the data grid is prepended to each rule in order to help prevent any naming clashes. There are lots more options that are available to you, so all you have to do is take a look through the API documentation. Let's have a brief overview of those options now. The first set of properties that we have are the row focus properties, and the first of those is the rows IDs property. This can be used to give each row its own unique ID. This ID is then given to various events via the meter information that's given to the event. You can also get this metadata from the RGraph registry if you prefer. There's an example of doing so in the data grid API documentation. You can set the data grid to check either a checkbox or select a radio button in the row when it's clicked. A common thing to allow users to have easy interaction with your datagrid. There can be multiple checkboxes or radio buttons in each row. The column properties allow you to specify headers or footers for the data grid. The headers are what you click on to facilitate sorting. And if you don't give any headers, then the data grid will not be sortable. The headers sit within a t-head HTML tag, and similarly, the footers sit within a t-foot tag. The widths of the columns can be given with the columns width property. Normally, you might not want to specify the column width, particularly if you're allowing the columns to be resized. But if you're showing something like an ID number in the first column, then you might want this column to be narrower than the others. The columns HTML property allows you to use HTML in the data grid, which is not permitted by default. By doing this, you could show an image in a column, for example. This property can be a range of column indexes. See the documentation for details on column ranges. There's a section dedicated to explaining them. The column CSS class property allows you to add your own CSS class to a column, both the TH and the TD tags. This can help you when styling your data grid. This property can be either a string or an array of strings. If it's an array, then the CSS class is added to the corresponding column's TH or TD tag. The columns formatter property controls whether a particular column has numerical formatting applied to it. If it does, then the columns unit is pre, the columns unit is post, columns point, columns thousand, and columns decimals properties are all used together in order to format the column in question as you specify. The columns formatter property can be used to format both numerical and string-based values and present them for display to the user. For numeric values, you can format it in much the same way that you would any other number, perhaps adding commas or adding a postfix to the number so that it's not as large and is more readable. For string type values, the value could be a timestamp that came out of a database and looked like a standard SQL timestamp, but you could format it and make the number far more readable so that it looks far more like a human readable timestamp. The columns resizable options allow you to adjust the sizing of the columns as you see fit. Ellipses are shown when the column is too small for the data within it. By default, the column sizes aren't persistent as a result of resizing, but you can change this with the columns resizable persistent option. You can also disable resizing for a column if you want, using the columns resizable handles property. This can be a range of column indexes. And the last columns option is the columns descriptions property, which allows you to add area descriptions to each column if you want, which enhance the accessibility of their data grid. Then we come to the sorting options for the data grid, which allow you to control how the sort functionality behaves. It can be done on all of the columns by default, though columns can be disabled if you want, and you can click a column header to sort by that column in ascending order. Click on the same column again to change to descending order, and then click the column one more time to return to the original unsorted state. You can disable sorting on one or more columns if you want, and the sorting can be made persistent so that the column and direction order is remembered across page refreshes. The sortable initial and sortable initial direction properties allow you to stipulate the initial sorting for the data grid. And finally, the sortable compare property allows you to give a function or an array of functions that handle the sorting. For example, you might want to sort a column by the day of the week instead of alphabetically. There's an example of a sort function that sorts by the last character in the cell in the API documentation. The search feature that's part of the data grid is quite versatile. It can be enabled by setting the search property to true. You will then see a search box at the top left of your data grid. The placeholder text can be customized, and whether the search box gets focused or not when the page loads can also be set. You may not want the search box to get focused if your data grid is off screen when the page loads, because if it does get focused, then that can cause the page to jump. The search exclude property can be used to exclude one or more columns from searching. For example, you might not want a column of ID numbers to be searchable. By default, the data grid search is JavaScript based and happens within the browser. This means that the URL is not updated, and also that you can't link directly to a search. The search URL properties, however, allow you to change this to a server-based search. So when you type something into the search box and press enter, the URL is updated and a new page is requested from the server. You can then use the get parameters that are given on the search on your server and return the relevant results. The search URL random property can be used to avoid any caching issues and add a random number onto the end of the URL. Okay, let's scroll this back up to the top of the page so that you can see the data grid. There we go, lovely. Now let's talk about the types of search that are available. There are two different types of search that you can use from the same search box above the data grid. First is a standard word search with basic wildcard support, so you can just type in a word into the search box, either upper or lowercase, and the data grid will restrict the rows that are displayed to those that contain that word somewhere in the row. It may be a word by itself, or it may be a part of a larger word. With the basic word search, you can use simple wildcards such as the asterisk and the question mark. The asterisk represents any number of characters, whilst the question mark represents only a single character. There's an implicit asterisk added to each side of the word, so the phrase Ichar, I-C-H-A-R, would find the name Richard. The other type of search that's available to you is a more advanced regular expression-based search. You can activate this type of search by enclosing your search phrase in forward slashes, just like you do in JavaScript. You can then use the power that regular expressions give you in your search phrase, and the data grid will try to match the phrase against each row. Note that whilst basic wildcard searches are case insensitive, i.e. anything is matched, the regular expression search is indeed case sensitive, though you can change this by using the I flag after the closing forward slash. Moving on to the paging properties. These are properties that allow you to restrict the amount of data that's shown at once and provide links to see the rest, i.e. more pages of data. So your set of 65 rows may be split up into 3 pages of 25, 25 and 15 rows. Paging is enabled by default. The paging per page property simply stipulates how many results you want to see on each page, and the paging current property stipulates the start page. This overrides whatever the page stored in the web browser's local storage area is. The paging max page links property can be used to stipulate how many page links are shown at once. The paging persistent property can be used to stipulate whether page information is stored in the local storage area and thus maintained across page refreshes. You can use the paging position and paging label properties to control the aesthetics of the page information that by default is on the top right of the data grid. The last paging properties are the paging URL properties. These can be used to change the paging from being based on using the local storage area in the browser to using the query string. This means that you could set it so that the page number is retrieved from the page query string parameter. Okay, now if you have a look at the data grid on screen at the moment, you can see there that it has a number of rows, so many in fact that there are 3 pages. We go to page 2 and we've got another page of data there. And we go to page 3 and there's not quite enough data to fill the data grid, so it shrinks to the correct size. And that's wonderful. And we can reorder, maybe resize a column or 2. Let's just try resizing that and that. And let's expand that again. Order by day of the week. Notice that it orders by the day of the week, but alphabetically instead of the actual day of the week. If you wanted to order by the actual day of the week, say Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, and so on, then you would need to use custom sorting for that. But getting back to paging, we've reordered the data grid, resized the columns on the data grid. So if you change page again, that stays the same. And again, we can go to page 1, 2, and 3. Okay then. Editing values on the data grid is allowed when you set the editable property to true. This means that you can then edit the values on the data grid by double clicking on them. When you do this, the cell is changed such that a form input appears with the unformatted number set as the value. When the user has made their change and pressed enter, there are events triggered which you can attach functions to send the edits back to the server. The edit events are before edit save, after edit save, edit complete, and edit cancelled. The editable columns property allows you to specify a range of column indexes that you want to allow edits to. For example, you might only have a single column on the data grid that you want to be editable. There's an example of editing that you can see in the demos that come with RGraph, and you can basically see if editing will fit your needs by looking at this demo. The final set of properties are classed as miscellaneous, but are no less important. In fact, the style property may be the property that will be used the most. It allows you to specify CSS rules that get applied to the data grid, allowing you to tailor the appearance to fit your desired aesthetic. With this property, you stipulate an array of strings, each of these strings being a standard CSS rule that gets applied to your document. The ID of the data grid is a prefix to each rule to try and limit the rules that you give to this specific data grid. A note about specificity. Your CSS rule should be as specific as you can make them. So for example, if you want TV cells to have a certain color as the background, it's better to be verbose and specify a full CSS path such as table, tbody, tr, td, rather than just td. This will lead to fewer moments where you're left staring at the screen, wondering why your CSS is not working. The description and caption options are similar. The description option allows you to add an area description, and the caption option allows you to add a standard caption tag to the datagrid's underlying table. Note though that the caption tag can sometimes be skipped by screen readers, so you may want to opt instead for a regular HTML heading. The last option is the events option. Like the other RGraph objects, this allows you to add your own functions as event listeners to any of the datagrid events. It's an object and the properties are the event names, such as row click, draw, cell click, or edit complete, whilst the values of those properties are functions that will run when the events are fired. As well as functions, the values can also be arrays of functions for when you want more than one to run for a particular event. We'll get into events a bit later on in the video. Now let's move on to the methods that are available to you. These allow you to easily work with the datagrid and add, remove, or retrieve data as required. The methods that are available to you are: the get and set methods are standard accessors that you can use to get and set properties of the datagrid, just like the other RGraph objects. The get data method returns the datagrid data to you. The raw data in the object is not just a regular array, so if you want just the data, you should use this method to get it. Similarly, the row and column methods return a row or column of the data to you. The index can be negative, in which case the indexing is counted from the end of the data, and if the given index doesn't exist, then null is returned. The set data method allows you to set data on the datagrid. This method alters the data and sets up the internal data structure that the datagrid uses. So you should use this method instead of setting the data on the datagrid directly. As well as containing extra metadata, the data property may not be in the original unsorted order. So if that's what you want, then you can use the get unsorted data method. Similar to this, the get original index method returns the original unsorted index of the index that you give it. The reset data method resets the data back to the original unsorted state. After it does this, the reset data event is fired. The append, prepend, insert, and delete methods allow you to edit data on the datagrid, adding and taking away from it as required. Each of these methods finds the relevant event after it has finished. The find function allows you to search through your data for a specific item. You can use a basic string search, or you can instead use a regular expression to do the matching. Normally, this function will stop when it finds the first match, but you can change this by specifying the all option as the second argument. The clear method clears the container div and removes the data grid from the document. There are two events that pertain to this method, and they are the before clear and clear events. The redraw method also clears the data grid, but then redraws it as well. It twofies two events, and they are the before redraw and redraw events. The reset sort data method allows you to reset the sort data back to the original unsorted state, and the exec method is the same as the exec method on the other RGraph objects, allowing you to run code there and then, not waiting for a particular event to occur. The on method is present for compatibility with other RGraph objects and is the old way to add events to the data grid. This method is largely redundant now though, with the newer events property that's now available. The last method that's available to you is the parse cell identifier method. This method takes an Excel style cell identifier such as A2, C7 or BD77 and provides you with the corresponding row and cell index in the form of an object with the two properties, row and column. Now let's talk about the events that the data grid makes available to you. These events allow you to attach your own code to a particular event so that you can act accordingly and trigger your own logic, allowing you to integrate the data grid closely into your website or application. The events are added to the data grid objects by using the events property that was mentioned previously, and the available events are the before draw, first draw, draw, before redraw, and redraw events fire when the data grid is drawn or redrawn. The before clear and clear events happen when the data grid is cleared. The reset data event fires when the reset data method is called. The before sort and sort events happen when the data grid is sorted. The append, prepend, insert, and delete events fire when the relevant method is called to modify the data. The row click and cell click events fire when a row or cell is clicked. There's metadata available to these two events that's passed to your event listener function as the second argument. This metadata will allow you to act accordingly when the events are fired. The before edit save, after edit save, edit complete, and edit cancelled events are all fired in the process of making edits to the data grid if editing is enabled. Again, there's metadata available to you that is passed as the second argument to your event listener function, and it will help you make decisions and act accordingly. And finally, the resize begin, resize, and resize end events all happen in the process of resizing a column. The final thing that we're going to talk about is integrating the data grid with forms. The div tag that the data grid is added to can sit anywhere on the page, and that includes it being part of a form. As well as that, if you stipulate that one or more of the columns of the data grid contains HTML, then the data grid itself can contain HTML, and therefore form elements. So, as part of the data array that you give to the data grid, you could give the HTML checkbox input tag, set the column's HTML property appropriately, and see a checkbox in the first field of the data grid. Add a submit button below the data grid, and you can provide a way for your users to make a choice. There are examples of data grids in forms and the relevant source code on the data grid documentation page on the website. You could also use the style option to provide the correct CSS that makes it look as though the checkboxes are on the left-hand side of the table, despite still being part of the main table. And there's example CSS for that too. Common functionality when you have this sort of layout is to provide a button to check all of the checkboxes at once. And there's an example too of that along with the relevant source code. So that's the data grid that's now a part of the RGraph library. The documentation page is essential reading if you intend to use the data grid on your website. There are also a few FAQs at the bottom of the page that are worth reading. If you have any problems with the data grid or questions about it, then feel free to post a question in the RGraph support forum and I'll get back to you with an answer. See you in the next video.